History of Life on Earth. The Unbroken Chain from the First Life to You. Chapter 9. Breaking Free of Water. The Egg That Opened a Continent. 9.1 The Leash. Every spring, on the first warm, rainy night, they come out of the woods. Spotted salamanders, wood frogs, spring peepers, thousands of them, emerging from under logs and out of burrows, and they all start walking in the same direction, toward water. They cross roads and die on them by the thousands. They cross lawns and driveways and highways. In some towns, volunteers go out with flashlights and buckets and carry them across. They are going back to the pond. They have no choice. They cannot lay their eggs anywhere else. That is the Leash Chapter 8 left us holding. Those animals can walk. They can breathe air. Some of them live in trees, and some of them freeze solid for the winter and thaw out alive in the spring. They are, by any reasonable definition, land animals. And every single one of them is still tethered, not by its legs or its lungs, but by an egg. A naked ball of jelly with nothing to hold water in. Lay it in dry air and it's dead in an afternoon, which means that for something like 60 million years, an entire planet sat there unused. The continental interiors, the uplands, the dry plains, the high country. Everywhere the rain was unreliable, everywhere there was no standing water within walking distance of a nest, all of it was closed to vertebrate life, and it was closed by a membrane. Then, somewhere in the coal swamps of the Carboniferous, a lineage of tetrapods solved it. They did not solve it by learning to develop without water. That was never possible. An embryo needs to be wet, and no amount of evolution was going to change that. They solved it by bringing the water with them. 9.2 The World of Coal and Giants. The Carboniferous, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, is named for what it left behind. Carbon-bearing. Coal. Picture the world that made it. Immense, flat, waterlogged forests stretching for thousands of kilometers across the tropics. Dominated not by anything you'd recognize, but by scale trees. Lycopsids, relatives of today's little club mosses, grown to 30 meters or more, with trunks covered in diamond-patterned scars and almost no branches until the very top. Beneath them, tree ferns and horsetails the size of pines. Standing water everywhere. Rotting vegetation everywhere. And when those trees fell, they didn't fully rot. They sank into stagnant anoxic swamp water and were buried, carbon and all, in colossal quantities over tens of millions of years. That buried carbon is coal. It is the coal that fired the Industrial Revolution, and it is still, in altered form, the coal being burned today. The energy in it is carboniferous sunlight, captured by trees and never released until we found it. Now, two things about this world. The air was extraordinary, because photosynthesis pulls carbon dioxide from the air and releases oxygen. And because all that carbon was being locked away instead of rotting, which would have consumed the oxygen right back. Atmospheric oxygen climbed and climbed. Estimates put carboniferous oxygen somewhere around 30 to 35% against today's 21. And with air that rich, the ceiling lifted. Chapter 6 explained why insects can't get large. Their tracheal tubes deliver air by diffusion, and diffusion fails over distance. But raise the oxygen concentration and the same tubes deliver far more, far deeper, into a much bigger body. So the Carboniferous had giants. Meganura, a dragonfly relative with a wingspan approaching 70 centimeters. Not a dragonfly the size of your hand. A dragonfly the size of a hawk, hunting on membranous wings through the mist between the scale trees. Arthroptera, a millipede relative that grew over 2 meters long. Not 2 meters of a snake's slender body. 2 meters of armored, many-legged, flat-backed arthropod, plowing through the leaf litter like a piece of agricultural machinery. We have its trackways. They are wider than a footpath. This was the world into which the first amniots hatched. And the thick air was a gift to them, too. Their lungs were still a work in progress, and the atmosphere was doing them a favor. Then the forests died. Toward the end of the Carboniferous, around 305 million years ago, the climate turned. Glaciers spread at the poles. The world got cooler and, critically, drier. And the great continuous swamp forests, which had been one enormous, connected, waterlogged world, broke apart, fragmenting into isolated islands of wet forest scattered across a drying landscape. Paleontologists call it the Carboniferous Rainforest collapse, and for amphibians, it was a disaster. Their entire existence depended on continuous wet habitat, and the wet habitat had just been shattered into pieces with dry ground in between. But there was a lineage in those swamps that had, by then, quietly acquired something new. It could lay its eggs on dry land. The world had just been remade into exactly the kind of place where that mattered, and a drying planet was handed to the only animals that didn't need it wet. 9.3 The Private Pond. The amniotic egg is one of the great pieces of engineering in the history of life, and it deserves to be looked at slowly, because almost everyone gets it wrong. The innovation is not the shell. A shell alone is a coffin. Seal an embryo inside a waterproof box, and you have solved exactly one problem, drying out while creating 4 new ones, every one of them fatal. It can't breathe. It can't get rid of its waste. It can't eat. And it still needs to be surrounded by water, or it can't develop at all. The amniotic egg solves all 4. And it does so with a set of structures that are, in one of the most elegant tricks in embryology, built by the embryo itself, tissues the embryo grows, uses, and then abandons, that never become part of its body. They're called extraembryonic membranes, and there are 4. The amnion, the private pond. This is the one that names the whole group, and it is the conceptual heart of everything. The amnion is a fluid-filled sac that wraps directly around the embryo and fills with water, and the embryo floats in it. It develops as every vertebrate embryo before it had always developed, submerged. Look at what that accomplishes. For 400 million years, development had required water. That requirement never went away and never could. What the amnion did was change where the water came from. The embryo no longer develops in water. It develops in its own water. The pond has been miniaturized, sealed, and packed inside the egg. An animal can now lay that egg on a hillside, and a burrow on a rock in the desert, 300 kilometers from the nearest standing water, and inside the shell, in absolute darkness, an embryo is still swimming. You did this too. You spent 9 months floating in an amniotic sac in salt water, doing exactly what a fish embryo does. When a pregnant woman's water breaks, that is the pond, 400 million years old, finally draining. The chorion, the lung. The chorion is the outermost membrane lining the inside of the shell and enclosing everything else. And because the shell is porous, riddled with microscopic pores that let gas through while blocking liquid water, the chorion, packed with blood vessels, can pull oxygen in through those pores and dump carbon dioxide out. The egg breathes through its shell. The Allantois, the septic tank, which is also part of the lung. Now, the problem nobody thinks about. A living embryo produces waste, specifically toxic nitrogen compounds from breaking down proteins. A fish embryo in a pond just lets them diffuse away into the surrounding water. Problem solved by the pond. But a sealed egg has nowhere to put them. There is no outside. For weeks, everything the embryo excretes stays in the box with it. So the amniotic egg grows a bag, the Allantois, and fills it with its own waste, sealing it away where it can't poison anything. And then, in a beautiful piece of biological thrift, the Allantois grows a rich blood supply and presses up against the chorion, and the two of them fuse into a single structure, the chorioallantoic membrane, which serves simultaneously as the egg's lung and its sewer. If you have ever peeled a hard-boiled egg and found a thin, tough, translucent film clinging to the shell that refuses to come off, that's it. That's the membrane that breathed. The yolk sac, the lunchbox. A sealed egg cannot eat, so it must bring provisions. The yolk is a dense package of fat and protein, and the yolk sac wraps around it and threads it with blood vessels, feeding the embryo from within for the entire development. And around all of this, the shell, leathery in most reptiles, hard and calcified in birds, which must perform a contradictory job. It has to keep water in while letting gas through. It is porous and waterproof at once, and it is not obvious that such a thing should be possible. And beneath the shell, the albumin, the egg white. Water, protein, cushioning, and a shock absorber, all at once. Now, 2 things that had to happen at the same time, or none of this works. First, you have to change your chemistry. The Allantois can only store waste if the waste is storable, and here amniotes made a hard choice. Fish and tadpoles excrete ammonia. It's cheap, you barely have to process it, but it is savagely toxic, and it only works if you can dump it instantly into a large volume of water. Fine when you live in a pond. Adult amphibians and mammals excrete urea. Less toxic, so it can be held for a while, but it's soluble and getting rid of it costs water. That's what urine is. Most reptiles and birds instead make uric acid. It costs more energy to produce, but it is nearly insoluble and almost non-toxic, which means it can be packed into the Allantois as a semi-solid paste and left there for weeks, right next to a developing embryo, doing no harm at all. And the payoff doesn't stop at hatching. An adult that excretes uric acid can get rid of its nitrogen as a near-dry paste, losing almost no water in the process. Which is why bird droppings have that chalky white component. That's the uric acid. And it is a large part of why lizards can live in deserts that would kill a frog in an hour. The egg and the chemistry are a matched pair. Neither one works properly without the other. Second, sex has to change. You cannot fertilize an egg through a shell. Once the shell goes on, the door is closed. Which means the sperm has to reach the egg before the shell is deposited around it, which means it has to happen inside the female's body. Internal fertilization is not an option for amniotes. It is a requirement. Most amphibians spawn. The female releases eggs into the water, the male releases sperm over them, and fertilization happens out in the pond. That entire strategy became impossible the moment the shell was invented. So the shelled egg forced a wholesale redesign of vertebrate sex, copulation, mating behavior, courtship, everything that follows from the fact that two animals must physically come together. The amniotic egg did not merely change where vertebrates could live. It changed how they mate, and it has been shaping the behavior of every reptile, bird, and mammal on Earth ever since. And notice one final thing in the difference between an amphibian and an amniote. The tadpole is gone. An amniote hatches as a miniature version of its parents, legs, lungs, and all. No aquatic larva, no metamorphosis, no gills. Biologists call this direct development. But look closer at what actually happened. The aquatic larval stage didn't vanish. It was moved. Everything a tadpole does out in the pond, an amniote embryo now does inside the shell, in water, in private, on its own supplies. The aquatic phase of vertebrate development was not abolished. It was taken indoors. 9.4 the waterproof skin. The egg was one leash. The skin was the other. Amphibian skin, remember, is a compromise. It has to stay thin, wet, and permeable, because a huge amount of the animal's oxygen comes in through it. And a skin that lets oxygen and lets water out. That is why an amphibian in dry air is, at all times, evaporating. Amniotes closed the hole, and they closed it with keratin. Amniote's skin is thick, dry, and packed with keratin, the same tough structural protein in your fingernails and your hair. The outer layer, the stratum corneum, is a barrier of dead, flattened cells crammed with the stuff, and reptiles reinforce it further by laying down lipids in the gaps between cells, sealing them like caulk between tiles. The result is skin that water cannot get out of, which is the whole game. A lizard can sit on a hot rock in the Sonoran Desert at midday and simply not care, because it is wrapped in a waterproof bag. But look at what it cost. A skin that water can't leak out of is a skin that oxygen can't leak in through. The moment amniotes sealed themselves, they permanently forfeited breathing through their skin. Amniotes are obligate lung breathers. There is no backup. A frog that can't fill its lungs can still absorb oxygen through its skin. A lizard, a bird, a mammal that can't fill its lungs simply dies. Every trait in evolution is like this, and it's worth naming clearly because it's a pattern we'll keep meeting. You cannot solve one problem for free. Amniotes bought themselves the desert, and the price was that their lungs now had to carry the entire load alone forever. So the lungs had to get better. 9.5 Learning to inhale. A frog does not inhale. It swallows air, dropping the floor of its mouth, sealing its nostrils, and shoving the air down into its lungs with a shrug of its throat. Buccal pumping, from Chapter 8, and you can watch it happening anytime a frog sits still. It's limited by the size of the mouth, it's awkward to coordinate with running, and it caps the whole animal. Amniots threw it out and built something fundamentally different. Costal aspiration. Rib-driven breathing. Muscles between the ribs contract and pull the rib cage outward and upward, expanding the chest cavity. And when a sealed cavity expands, the pressure inside it drops, below the pressure of the atmosphere outside. And then the atmosphere does the work. Air is pushed in by the weight of the sky. Put your hand on your ribs and take a breath. Feel them lift. You are not sucking air in, there's no such thing. You are opening a space, and 14 pounds per square inch of atmosphere is filling it for you. This is negative pressure breathing, and against the frog's gulp it wins on every count. Volume? A rib cage can expand vastly more than a mouth can. Freedom. You can breathe with your mouth shut or full of food. Scalability. It works at any body size. Buccal pumping does not. It fails as the animal gets bigger. Endurance. It integrates with running in a way gulping never could. And everything that comes later is built on this pump. The birds will take it in, add a system of air sacs that drives air through the lungs in one direction, continuously on both the inhale and the exhale, the most efficient vertebrate lung ever evolved. And the reason a bar-headed goose can fly over the Himalayas at altitudes where a human would black out. The mammals will take it in, add a diaphragm, an entire dedicated muscle sheet slung beneath the lungs, doing nothing but breathing, pulling harder than ribs alone ever could. Both of those are variations on the same principle. Both of them presuppose the pump that appears, for the first time, right here. 9.6 The half-divided heart. Chapter 8 left the amphibian heart at 3 chambers, 2 atria, 1 ventricle, with the fresh and used blood mixing in a single pumping chamber. Reptiles improved it, but they did not simply build their way toward ours, and this is where a lot of textbooks go wrong. Most reptiles keep a single ventricle, but grow a partial wall down the middle of it, an incomplete septum. Combined with carefully timed contractions and pressure differences, the 2 blood streams stay far more separate in practice than the raw anatomy would suggest. Functionally, the reptile ventricle behaves like several chambers, and the blood is directed through them with real precision. But here is the part worth sitting with. The incomplete wall is not a failure. It's a feature, because a partly divided ventricle lets a reptile do something you cannot do. It can deliberately shunt blood away from the lungs and send it straight back out to the body. Ask yourself when that would be useful. A sea turtle diving for 40 minutes. A crocodile lying motionless on the bottom of a river with its lungs full of stale air. A snake digesting a meal, unmoving, for a week. In every one of those situations, pumping blood through the lungs is pointless. There's no oxygen there to collect. So the reptile simply roots around them and saves the work. The reptilian heart is not a botched mammalian heart. It is a flexible heart, built for an animal with a completely different metabolic strategy. One that can be nearly inert for days, and doesn't want to pay for a system it isn't using. We gave that flexibility up. We can't shunt. We are locked into pumping blood through our lungs every single beat of our lives, because our metabolism never rests. And the crocodiles cheat. Crocodilians, alone among living reptiles, have a fully 4-chambered heart, with a complete wall down the ventricle, exactly like yours. And they also kept a shunt, a small connection between the 2 great arteries leaving the heart, called the foramen of Peniza, that lets them bypass the lungs during a dive. They have the high-performance heart and the reptilian trick. They didn't choose. They took both, and birds and mammals each built the 4-chambered heart independently, twice, separately, from a 3-chambered ancestor, in 2 lineages that had already been apart for 150 million years. Both did it because both, independently, became warm-blooded, and a warm-blooded animal has a metabolic furnace that cannot be allowed to burn undiluted fuel. Same problem, same solution, twice. It is one of the finest examples of convergence in the vertebrate body. 9.7 Rebuilding for gravity. Again, a real neck. Tiktaalik invented the neck. Amniots perfected it. The 2 vertebrae at the very top of your spine are unlike any others in your body, and they are named for what they do. The first is the atlas, after the titan who held up the sky, because it is the vertebra that holds up your skull. It's a ring, and it lets your head tip forward and back. That's your yes. The second is the axis, and it has a peg sticking up out of it, straight through the ring of the atlas above. The atlas, and your entire skull with it, rotates around that peg. That's your no. Nod right now and then shake your head. You have just used two joints, of completely different design, stacked on top of one another. Every time you look over your shoulder, your skull is pivoting on a bony post that a Permian synapsid grew, so that it could keep its eyes on something while its body stayed still. A spine that can carry a body. Vertebrae grow more robust. The interlocking projections that keep the spine from sagging get stronger. The whole axial skeleton is built for larger bodies and harder use. Legs underneath. The first amniotes still sprawled with their legs out sideways like a lizard's, and that means the whole body has to bend side to side with every step, and Chapter 8's carrier's constraint still applies. Bend the trunk laterally, and you squeeze one lung while inflating the other. You cannot run and breathe, which is why a lizard sprints, stops, and pants. It has no choice. The way out is to bring the limbs in under the body so they swing forward and back like pendulums, instead of out and around like oars. The trunk stops writhing. Breathing and running stop fighting. And here's the striking thing, it happened twice, independently. The dinosaur lineage did it. The mammal lineage did it. Two groups, separated by hundreds of millions of years of divergence, faced the same mechanical problem and arrived at the same answer, on their own. Every animal alive today that can run for a long time, a horse, a wolf, an ostrich, a human, is standing on legs that got underneath the body. And it is not a coincidence that these are the same animals that can breathe while doing it. Claws. And a small note, because it shows how evolution economizes. The same keratin that waterproofed the skin was pressed into service on the toes, hardened into claws for digging, gripping, climbing, and killing. One protein, two revolutions. 9.8 The split that made you. And now we come to a fork in the road, and it is the most important one left in this book. Almost as soon as amniotes appeared, by about 320 to 310 million years ago, in the coal swamps, the lineage split in two, and it has stayed split ever since. The traditional way to tell the two branches apart is by looking at holes in the skull. Behind the eye socket, in the temporal region, some amniotes evolved openings called fenestrae. They lighten the skull, and, far more importantly, they give jaw muscle somewhere to bulge as they contract, which means a bigger muscle, which means a harder bite. Synapsids have one hole on each side, low behind the eye. Diapsids have two, stacked one above the other, and that's it. That's the whole difference, at the start. Two lineages of very similar looking, sprawling, lizardish creatures scuttling through the same swamp, distinguishable mostly by a hole in the head. The Diapsids became the reptiles, the dinosaurs, and the birds. The Synapsids became us. Now, the thing that must be said as loudly as possible, because it is misunderstood constantly. Mammals did not evolve from reptiles. Never happened. Not once. The two lineages split from a common amniote ancestor, over 300 million years ago, and have been separate the entire time. Your ancestors were never lizards. They were never dinosaurs. They were never anything you would call a reptile. They were synapsids, a completely separate branch of the amniote tree, walking around in the Permian in a world where mammals did not yet exist and neither did reptiles as we know them. The old textbook phrase for these animals was mammal-like reptiles, and it is deeply, actively wrong. They were not reptiles that happened to look like mammals. They were members of the mammal lineage from before there were mammals. Consider Dimetrodon, the big sailback predator that appears in every dinosaur toy set and every dinosaur coloring book ever printed. Dimetrodon is not a dinosaur. Dimetrodon was extinct for 40 million years before the first dinosaur existed, and Dimetrodon is more closely related to you than it is to Tyrannosaurus, or to a crocodile, or to a lizard, or to a sparrow. That sail-backed monster is on your side of the family tree. It's a cousin. It's on the branch that leads, eventually, to warm blood and hair, and milk, and a hand holding this book. Two more corrections, quickly, in the same spirit as the rest of this book. Reptile isn't a real group, not in the strict sense. Birds descend from dinosaurs, which are diapsids, so any group, called reptilia, that excludes birds is one of those leftover categories, defined by what it leaves out. Same problem as invertebrate, agnatha, and fish. The honest term for the whole branch is Sauropsida, reptiles, and birds together, which means, a crocodile is more closely related to a sparrow than to a lizard. Genuinely, the crocodile and the bird share a more recent ancestor with each other than either does with anything scaly and four-legged in your garden. And the turtles fooled everyone. Turtles have no holes in their temples at all, no fenestrae, which, for a century, made them look like the most primitive amniotes alive, survivors from before the Great Split, the last of the original design. The genomes say otherwise. Turtles sit firmly inside the Diapsids. Most analyses put them close to the crocodile and bird group. Their ancestors had 2 holes in the skull, and their descendants closed them up again, secondarily, and grew a solid armored box of a head to go with the armored box of a body. The most primitive skull in the Amniotic world turns out to be one of the most heavily modified. By now this should feel familiar. It's the sea squirt eating its own brain. It's the hagfish losing its spine. Simple looking is not the same as primitive, and a lineage will happily throw away anything it no longer needs. 9.9 The other branch. This book follows the Synapsids because we are Synapsids, but it would be a scandal to pass over what the other branch did with itself, because for most of the last 300 million years, they were winning. The Lepidosaurs, lizards, snakes, and the Tuatara kept the sprawling posture, and the low-cost, sit-and-wait metabolic strategy, and diversified into an enormous range of animals, from geckos that can walk on ceilings to chameleons that fire their tongues faster than you can blink. And the snakes deserve a moment, because they're a walking, so to speak, demonstration of everything this book has been arguing. Snakes are lizards that lost their legs, not a separate ancient lineage, a branch from within the lizards, that gave up limbs entirely because a long body that can pour itself into a burrow or through the leaf litter turned out to be superb, and they didn't quite finish the job. Look at a boa constrictor or a python, and you'll find, buried in the flesh near the tail, a pair of vestigial hip bones, a pelvic girdle, connected to nothing, supporting nothing, going nowhere. In some species, the remnants poke out through the skin as tiny spurs, which the males use during courtship. A snake carrying the ruins of a pelvis, hundreds of millions of years after the last of its ancestors walked. Evolution does not clean up after itself. It leaves the wreckage in place. The Archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, took over the world. That branch gave rise to the crocodilians. It gave rise to the pterosaurs, which became the first vertebrates ever to fly under their own power, about 100 million years after the insects of Chapter 6 had already been doing it. And it gave rise to the dinosaurs, which ran the terrestrial world for 150 million years, and among which one lineage of feathered theropods became something else. Birds are dinosaurs, not descended from, or, cladistically, in exactly the way that you are a mammal and a mammal is a vertebrate. The dinosaurs are not extinct. There are 10,000 species of them, and one of them just landed on your fence. And this is why our own story goes the way it does. For over 150 million years, the Synapsids, our lineage, lived underneath the Archosaurs. Small, nocturnal, hiding, marginal. Every large ecological role on land was already taken, and taken by something that would eat us. That's not a footnote. That's 150 million years of being nobody, and it shaped everything about what mammals became. And then, having escaped the water at such enormous cost, they went straight back in. The ichthyosaurs, which converged so thoroughly on the body of a dolphin that you would struggle to tell a silhouette apart. The plesiosaurs, with their absurd, magnificent necks. The mosasaurs, the great marine lizards. They gave up the land their ancestors had fought for, and returned to the sea. And the ichthyosaurs did something the whole chapter has been building toward, and then undid it. They abandoned the egg. A shelled egg cannot be laid at sea. It would sink and drown. So ichthyosaurs evolved live birth, and we have fossils of them caught in the act, a calf emerging tail first from its mother 200 million years ago. The mammals will do all of this again later with the whales, which tells you something important about what the amniotic egg actually was. It was not a command to live on land. It was a permission. And the moment the ocean started looking rewarding again, lineage after lineage took the permission and went back. 9.10 Our branch. In the shadows, now home, the earliest synapsids show up in the late Carboniferous and take over the early Permian. They're often called Pelycosaurs, and Dimetrodon is the star, a sprawling, sail-backed apex predator, up to 4.5 meters long, ruling a world with no dinosaurs in it. And already, this early, it carries the trait that will define our entire lineage. Look at its teeth. A reptile's teeth are, by and large, all the same, simple cones, more or less identical from front to back, replaced endlessly throughout life. A crocodile has a mouth full of interchangeable spikes for holding on. It cannot chew. It swallows things whole or tears them apart and swallows the pieces. Dimetrodon had different teeth in different places, some sharp and stabbing near the front, different ones behind. Its name means, precisely, 2 measures of tooth. That's heterodentition, and it is the beginning of one of the most consequential things mammals ever did, which is to process food in the mouth rather than just capturing it. Teeth that cut, teeth that stab, teeth that grind. A mouth that is a factory, not just a trap. Open your mouth in front of a mirror. Incisors for cutting, canines for gripping and tearing, premolars and molars for grinding. 4 different tools in one jaw, working together. That began in the Permian, in a sail-backed animal that looked nothing at all like you. Then came the Therapsids, in the middle and late Permian, and they went further down the same road. Legs coming underneath the body, teeth differentiating into recognizable incisors, canines, and cheek teeth. A bigger hole in the skull, and therefore a bigger jaw muscle, and therefore a harder bite. The first hints of a secondary palate, a bony shelf separating the nasal passage from the mouth, so the animal could breathe while chewing, which sounds trivial and is not. Hold that thought for Chapter 10, and skeletal hints of a metabolism running hotter than a reptiles, possibly, just possibly, the beginnings of warm blood. The Therapsids were the dominant large land animals of the Permian. This was our world. Our lineage was on top. And then, 252 million years ago, the world ended. The Permian Triassic extinction, the Great Dying, is the worst thing that has ever happened to life on Earth. Not the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. This one, it killed an estimated 90% or more of marine species, and around 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. The likeliest cause is the Siberian traps, a volcanic eruption on a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind, in which lava poured out across an area the size of Western Europe, for perhaps 1 million years, burning through coal deposits as it went, dumping staggering volumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere, acidifying the oceans, stripping the oxygen out of the seas, and cooking the planet. The Therapsids were devastated, and in the strange, empty, recovering world of the Triassic, the survivors that rose to fill the vacuum were not ours, they were the Archosaurs. The dinosaurs' long reign begins right here, in the wreckage, and our lineage, which had run the Permian, was pushed to the edges of the world and held there for the next 150 million years. But one group of Therapsids survived, the Cynodonts, dog teeth, and it is from inside this group that mammals will eventually come. Through the Triassic, they become more and more familiar. A full secondary palate, teeth in an unmistakably mammalian arrangement, a jaw increasingly dominated by a single large bone at the front, growing steadily larger and taking over the jaw joint, and watch that bone, because what happens to the ones it's replacing is one of the most astonishing stories in all of anatomy, and it is the first thing in Chapter 10. There is evidence for whiskers, small pits in the snout bones where the nerves ran, and whiskers are modified hairs, which means hair, probably endothermy, warm blood, generated from within, burning fuel to hold a constant temperature, and they got small, very small, shrew-sized, rat-sized, because in a world owned by Archosaurs, every large niche was taken, and being large meant being eaten. So they went small, and they went nocturnal, out at night, in the dark, when the ectothermic Archosaurs were sluggish and cold, and the warm-blooded little Cynodont could still run. It sounds like defeat. It sounds like a lineage in retreat, reduced to hiding in the dark under the feet of giants. It was, and it was also the crucible. Because a small nocturnal animal cannot rely on its eyes. It needs to hear exquisitely, and to smell, and to feel its way through the dark with whiskers. And all of that demands more brain. It needs to be warm in the cold of night, which demands hair and a high metabolism, which demands more oxygen, which demands a better heart and a better lung. It needs to grow fast on scarce food. Every one of those pressures, hearing, smell, touch, warmth, brain, was applied relentlessly, for 150 million years, to a small frightened animal living in the dark. And what came out the other side was a mammal. 9.112 branches. Everything in this chapter comes down to one thing, a membrane full of water. The Amnion, a private pond, sealed inside a shell, carried up the beach and over the hills, and into the deserts, and inside it, an embryo swimming in the sea its ancestors never really left. Around it, a Chorion to breathe through the shell, an Allantois to hold the poison, a yolk sac to carry the lunch, and with it, the chemistry to make the waste harmless, and a wholesale reinvention of vertebrate sex to get the egg fertilized before the door closed. Around that egg, a waterproof skin, and lungs that had to become good enough to justify it, a heart dividing, a neck that could turn, and legs in 2 lineages, quietly moving underneath the body, where they could finally carry an animal a long way without stopping to breathe. And then, almost at once, the split. Sauropsids, and they got the dinosaurs, the pterosaurs, the crocodiles, the marine reptiles, the snakes, the birds, and the whole Mesozoic world. Synapsids, and they got Dimetrodon, the Therapsids, and then a catastrophe, and then 150 million years in the dark. 2 branches from one animal in one Carboniferous swamp. One of them ruled the earth, the other one got small, and grew hair, and learned to hear in the dark, and waited.